Now we come to this idea of a measure development process. And the process basically has a number of steps to developing a measure. And these are the steps. So you start with the concept and you define the concept. You delineate the domain. You design the measure and generate items. You do reliability, dimensionality, validity testing, and validation, right? Overall validation. And so this is a kind of what we will go through with a very specific example in mind. Okay, so this is the measure development process. And these are the steps, but I want to ask you, come on, why do I need all this? I have data. I got data, just let me analyze it. It's just you and your book and your, webinar and all that. I got data, I'll analyze the data. That's it. I'll analyze the data. And, and I'll just write up. Why do we need these steps in the measure development process? Why do we really need it, right? Why bother? Why do we need a measure development process? Okay, so type away. Why? Let's just collect data and analyze it. Do we need a measure development process? Srikanth, standardization, okay. Basically what you're saying is, I don't know that you reduce the distance, but there is a distance between your construct and the operationalization. And I keep hearing the standardization and comparability and repeatability. Why does it matter? You just do you got your research and you publish it. Who cares about repeatability? Who cares about comparability, right? That's where, we saw before the idea of using numbers as well. Right? Why? Standardized. We can speak to each other. Science is about a community activity, right? We speak to each other, we convince each other, we say, no, what you're doing is not right, because I showed it this way and that way. The whole thing is a community, is a community, really. And sometimes we stay in our own bubble, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I got this area called subsistence marketplaces. But then, I have to think about different approaches to poverty in business. I have to think about different approaches to poverty across the world, different disciplines like anthropology, right? And I have to couch what I do in the context of what has come before. That is an ultimate responsibility for us. And I'm not saying I've done it very well or anything, but I can tell you, we can certainly learn from my mistakes. So it's so important to couch what you've done and what has come before. And you do that at every level. You do that the research, you look at the phenomenon. You do that in terms of context. You do that in terms of the construct. You do that in terms of measurement. And you say, this is what I went through as a process, because this is the measure development process. Or you turn around and say, I already have data, I'm crunching data. But in order to interpret it in terms of what it means at a higher level, I need to have understood the measure development process if I were to design that measure. So now we come back to something you've already responded to. How do you develop a conceptual definition? So let's start with that first step, right? Literature. And you can say this is what they've talked about, but they have not talked about internationalization the way I'm talking about it, as in I'm talking about internationalization of employees or something like that, right? And so you look at the literature and you have to couch what you're doing in the literature. It's not just the hypothesis, it's each construct, right? You have to couch it. And if you're different, you have to show how you're different, right? And you have to use the words. You also have to say, you know what? I am looking at, here's what I'm looking at, but I'm not looking at this. It may be a related construct. I'm not looking at this. I'm looking at satisfaction, job satisfaction, right? But I'm not looking at happiness at the job, because happiness is a little different. It's related. So, one of the most important things to think about is what it is not just what it is, but what it is not. And that's so true for us. One of the first things, I would tell a doctoral student or really anybody would be, Figure out what you're interested in and why, and figure out what you're not interested in and why, or why not, right? It's a very similar idea. So you want to look at something that's related but different, right? And then you can look at phenomenon and come up. You can say, you know what? I looked at the phenomenon and I found that justice or internationalization, these are all very important things to look at. But you can't just say, I looked at a phenomenon and I came up with it. You have to go back to the literature and see how it's been handled, if it has been handled, and then you have to make the case. So preference for numerical information, I had to make the case in that article, which was in Journal of Applied Psych, that it is important. And here's why it's important, okay? So what it is not is a very important part of the definition. Now, once you do that, you delineate the domain. Okay, so you delineate the domain. And so I believe I have an example for you. And I'm going to basically say, here's an example and come back to the question. Preference for numerical information is defined as a preference or proclivity toward using numerical information and engaging in thinking involving numerical information. So this is my definition, and you, exactly like you said, I'm defining it in terms of other words, preference or proclivity, using, engaging in thinking involving numerical information, right? So I'm kind of going about it in that way, and I'm saying here is the definition. This is the conceptual definition. What is it? It's a definition in terms of other concepts. And this is somebody mentioned this in the word cloud as well, right? Using other words as well to measure it. Now let's go to the domain. And when I think of the domain of preference for numerical information, I say, okay, let me paint a picture for myself. I'm going to say enjoyment of numbers, satisfaction with numbers, importance of numbers, usage of numbers, interest in numbers, liking of numbers, and so on. I'm going to stop right there. And I'm going to have you take your construct that is of interest to you. And I'm going to have you draw out this picture and talk about and think about the domains of your construct. Okay. And I just want you to go through that exercise, because if you go back and let me just tell you what I was headed towards. Yeah. So if you go back, I want you to move along in the same way. So what you need to do now is you need to think about a conceptual definition, and you need to delineate the domain of your construct. All right. So before you get to that, let me just ask you a question. And I will ask it to you again later as well. All right. Is domain delineation a conceptual exercise or an operational exercise? Is it in the conceptual domain or the operational domain? All right. That's my question to you. Remember those two domains? So when I say you have to delineate the domain, what I mean by that is, it's not enough if you give me one sentence that says, this is my definition. It's not enough to say, this is preference for numerical, it's all done. No, you have to then explain it more, right? That's what domain delineation is. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm going to ask you to delineate the domain. And so I'm going to ask you to put down a conceptual definition. And then I'm going to ask you to delineate the domain. You can do this in your own notes because it's quite expanded, right? And I've already given you an example right here. This is my delineation of the domain of preference for numerical information. And I could have done it in words as well, which is there in the book in terms of saying this is what, this is what is involved and so on. But I want you to draw a picture though, and then write down parts of the domain within that picture, because I think it's important to visualize the domain of your construct. But before you do that, I want you to respond to one question, which is domain delineation a conceptual exercise or an operational exercise? All right. Most of the answers were, of course, that it's a conceptual exercise. And I'm glad though, because we are here to learn. And sometimes, people may think it's operational, but no, we have not yet gone to the operational. And we are only now going step by step, right? And so we have this measure development process. We're going step by step. Otherwise, the idea would be to say, okay, I have preference for numerical information. Now I'm just going to go out and measure it. And that is hard to do because of one reason. As you can already tell, if I were to go back, and sorry to do this to you, but if I were to go back to preference for numerical information, I have to travel that distance. I have to travel that distance before I get into the operational. And it's not enough to do that by just having a sentence as a definition. I have to travel that distance. That's the logic of a measure development process. You need that process because of the distance between the conceptual and the operational. You got to take those steps carefully. You got to traverse those steps carefully, right? And there are a couple of reasons why. One of them is that there is measurement error. And related to that is there are many different directions you can go when you traverse that distance and you want to validate that direction that you go. All right. So the way I would say that in my bad drawing is, if I can still, I'm going to try to share the whiteboard, that we talked about the conceptual, we talked about the operational, the measurement of it, and we talked about the distance. And because there is distance, there is error. And here you go, there is error, measurement error. And because there is distance, there are different ways in which you can arrive at the operational. And so you got to make a case for that. But that's what I mean. That because of that distance, because we are not looking at cost and things like that, this is where we end up. Here's what I want you to do. If I can, here you go. I want you to think about, and this is important, I want you to think about your construct. I want you to define it. And I want you to delineate the domain for yourself through a drawing. All right. I want you to do those two things for me: conceptual definition and visualization, and the domain of your construct. It is a conceptual exercise, and ideally I want you to draw it. All right. So that is what I want you to do.